Reconstruction. So, as you all know from class, Reconstruction was the period following the American Civil War. And essentially, it's almost what it sounds like. It was a period where the United States was rebuilding after it had literally been torn apart. There are three main questions that politicians are attempting to answer during the Reconstruction process. One of them is, what is the status of African Americans, both free and formerly enslaved? So when I say free, I mean they were free prior to the Civil War. To what extent are they given the same sort of civil liberties and rights as all citizens? To what extent should they be able to do things like vote, hold office? We'll get into all of that. The second question is political in nature. I know the first question is also sort of political, but this one is more about representation, Congress, things like that. Remember that during the Civil War, 11 states actually left the Union. So the political question is a process. How are they going to be brought back into the Union? And to what extent should they face some sort of punishment? And that's also a question about civilians. Should they be stripped of their land? Should they be stripped of their former jobs? Things along those lines. And then the third question is economic in nature. As you remember, towards the end of the Civil War, Sherman's March to the Sea is a great example of this. The South's economy was in shambles. So, to what extent is the entire country responsible for not only rebuilding the Southern economy, but also diversifying it so that it's not so heavily reliant on cotton? So, moving forward, let's get into the time frame. This video is going to touch upon these first two stages. Technically, Reconstruction started before the war ended. One could say that the Emancipation Proclamation was the beginning. Although to simplify it, I'm just going to say that Reconstruction started in 1865 when the Civil War officially ended. The first stage, we'll look at it now, and we might touch upon stage 2. Stage 3 will be saved for a future video. But 1865 to 1877 are the traditional dates for Reconstruction. When Lincoln was still alive, his plan was known as the 10% plan, and it was called that because the most important element of it was the part that required 10% of all the white male voters, I should have said that here, or rather people who were eligible to vote, took an oath of office, or oath of allegiance rather, to the Union. 10%. So that's a very, very small threshold. And that infers that a full 90% of that state's population could still be Confederate loyalists, and that's okay. Not okay, but you know what I'm getting at. Further, those states also had to agree to ratify the 13th Amendment in order to rejoin the Union. It was very lenient, as you can tell from this 10% threshold. Some other elements to it, it gave amnesty to former Confederates if they took that oath. That included a restoration of their property, of course, with the exception of enslaved people due to the 13th Amendment. The really important part, as far as the first question we asked in that previous slide is that there was nothing about freedom. There's nothing about what formerly enslaved people and all Black Americans, who, including those who were not enslaved prior to the war, what their status was. And that allowed 4 states to rejoin the Union, and we talked about these questions together in class. So Lincoln was assassinated, obviously, just a week after the war was over. So, actually, I'll get back to that in a second. My bad. I got ahead of myself. As a response to Lincoln's lenient 10% plan, the radical Republicans, and they're called radical because they were more, not progressive, that's not the right word. They were farther to the left. Remember, the Republican Party is almost the opposite in the 19th century as the Republican Party is today. They thought that the South needed to go through a more rigorous process in order to rejoin the Union. So they proposed a bill called the Wade-Davis Bill that required over half, a majority of those white male eligible voters to pledge support for the Union. And they also still had to ratify the 14th Amendment, or rather the 13th Amendment, I'm sorry. And then also they required that Black Americans were given equality before the law, but there was nothing about voting rights. The 15th Amendment will be coming soon. But Lincoln pocket vetoed this bill, and then he was assassinated. So when he was assassinated, Andrew Jackson was sworn in, and as you know in the reading and from class, Andrew Johnson was an unapologetic racist, and he was essentially a Democrat as far as the way he operated. So his plan did still ask for a majority of voters to take office, so that was reminiscent to the Wade Davis bill, but unlike the Wade Davis bill, there was absolutely no mention of any sort of citizenship voting, any attempt to establish civil liberties or civil rights to Black Americans. And then he also not only granted amnesty to Southerners, but he pardoned over 13,000 former Confederates. And that obviously shows us that Andrew Jackson is quite lenient in this process. You're probably not surprised that the radical Republicans did not like Johnson. Johnson also nicknames Reconstruction restoration, so you can think about how that word differs and why that might matter. Congress decides to do a whole bunch of things to respond to Johnson's plan and just to make their plan more forceful in general. They create a joint committee, that's both houses of Congress are on that committee, on Reconstruction. So it's a select committee. If you take Gov next year, we'll talk about how those work. They also passed the Freedmen Bureau's bill and the Civil Rights Act in 1866. Both of those successfully stayed on the books, even though Johnson vetoed them. It takes 2/3 of a majority of both houses of Congress to override a presidential veto. So that's really, really significant. And that was the first time ever in U.S. history that Congress successfully overrode a presidential veto. And in 1866, Congress goes forward with the 14th Amendment, which was ratified by a 3/4 majority of all the states by 1868. Now, Johnson can't do anything about a constitutional amendment, but he did openly oppose it. Moving forward, here's the 14th Amendment. You can pause and read it. So that essentially refines the definition of citizenship, and the 14th Amendment will really evolve over time in terms of its scope. Again, shameless plug to take Gov next year. So Congress in 1867 passes the Reconstruction Act, and what that does is that declares martial law, otherwise known as military rule in the South, and it divides the South up into these different districts. And that also means that there's a federal military presence in these states to attempt to make sure that they are enforcing all those Reconstruction policies that we previously mentioned. And in addition to this Reconstruction Act, they passed the Tenure of Office Act, and what that did was that made it illegal for the president to fire a member of their cabinet without Senate approval. And there's nothing about the Constitution that says that. And Johnson actually defies that law right away and fires his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and that's what leads to Congress impeaching him, although he was never removed from office. So you can probably, going back to this martial law just for a bit, if you're looking at this map, you might notice these two different dates. It's worth considering why those matter. So the first date, you can see that's the date that they formally rejoined the Union. And then that date in red, we'll get back to why this matters in class next week. But this shows you the year that the Reconstruction government that was set up in those states was defeated. And when I say that it was defeated, what I generally mean there is that those state legislatures elected a majority of Democrats into office. And they also start to pass their own laws that act as loopholes to things like the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. Those laws are also known as Jim Crow laws, and we'll get to those soon. We're hitting the 10-minute mark, so I think this is a good time to start. If you have any questions about any of the stuff we covered so far, do feel free to ask in class, or if you're not one of my students, drop something into the comments. There's a reason why I went all the way back in the slides. Oh, I know why. The reason why is to just remind you that what we talked about in this video so far are really these two elements. We'll pick back up in a future video with the remainder of Radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction, and also the end of Reconstruction. also known as redemption. And thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.